All right, hello everybody, this is AW again, continuing the reading of Kojeve's Introduction to the Reading of Hegel, the Lectures on the Phenomenology of Spirit. We're continuing chapter 5, which is a note on eternity, time, and the concept. We're going on to a second part, which is the second lecture in this chapter, lecture 7. If you have not listened to the first part, you definitely should listen to it, because this starts off where that first part begins. So, starting. I have discussed at some length the Platonic conception, which corresponds to possibility 2-1a. Lengthen the image, Hyperion. You posted on Twitter. Aristotle saw Plato's difficulties. Let me just restart that. I have discussed at some length the Platonic conception, which corresponds to possibility 2-1a. Let us now move on to Aristotle, that is to possibility 2-1b. Aristotle saw Plato's difficulties, and at the same time he made a great discovery. Just like Plato, Aristotle defines the concept as eternal. That is, he defines it as a relation to something else. And this something else for him, as for Plato, is not time, but eternity. Episteme exist only in the cosmos in which there are ideas, that is, eternal entities having eternity as their topos. But Aristotle saw what Plato seems not to have seen, namely that eternity is not outside of time, but in time. At the very least, there is something eternal in time. In fact, Plato reasoned as follows. All real dogs change. The concept dog, on the other hand, remains identical to itself. Therefore, it must be related to an eternity situated outside of real dogs, that is, outside of time. This eternity is the idea of dog, and consequently, in the final analysis, the idea of ideas. To which Aristotle answered, to be sure, the concept dog is related to eternity, but eternity subsists in time. For if real dogs change, the real dog, that is, the species dog, does not change. Since the species is eternal, even though it is placed in time, it is possible to relate the concept to eternity in time. Therefore, there is an absolute knowledge relating to the temporal world to the extent that this world implies eternity. In other words, Plato forgot that in Heraclitus River there are permanent eddies. First of all, they are the animals and the plants. The eternal or immutable axis of the eddies is the telos, or the entelechy. And this same entelechy is what appears in relation to the concept as the idea of the eddy. But there are also planets, and finally the cosmos. Hence, Aristotle says, time itself is eternal. It is circular, but the circle is gone round again and again, eternally. Therefore, the cosmos has the same structure as does the animal. The Aristotelian system thus gives an explanation of life and a biological conception of the world. Theologically speaking, the conception that relates the eternal concept to eternity in time equals polytheism. To be sure, Aristotle is too far removed from the totemic mentality to assert that animals and plants are gods, but when he says that the planets are gods, he maintains a greater agreement with his system than does Plato with his. But, all things considered, the difference is not very important. Mono or polytheism, in both cases we are dealing with a theological knowledge. The cosmic revolution is eternally repeated, and it is solely because there is an eternal repetition that there is an absolute knowledge relating to the cosmos. Now, it is one and the same eternity that manifests itself in and through the eternal return of time. In other words, there is a supreme God, the God properly so called, who maintains the cosmos in its identity and thus makes conceptual knowledge possible. And while manifesting itself through the course of time, this divine eternity differs essentially from everything that is in time. At most, man can speak of himself too, taken as species, when he speaks of God. It remains nonetheless true that the difference is essential between him, taken as historical individual, and the eternal God of whom he speaks. Once more then, as in Plato, it is an absolute knowledge, or of Bewusstsein, and not the Selbstbewusstsein, knowledge of knowing and self-knowing. For the species has no self-knowing, no self, Selbst or self. At the most it says we, but not I. Therefore, the Aristotelian system explains a man's biological existence, but not his truly human, that is, historical existence. and we see this even better by turning to the anthropological level, that is, by posing the problem of freedom. To be sure, Aristotle talks about freedom, but everyone talks about freedom, even Spinoza. But if it is not to be a word game, if the true notion of freedom, made explicit in the Hegelian conception, as it is formulated in the Phenomenology, is sought, it must be admitted that it is not compatible with Aristotle's system. As a matter of fact, we know that this system excludes by definition a creative God. By definition, for eternity in time signifies eternity of the world, return, and eternal return. Now, where there is no place for God's creative action, there is still less place for man's creative action. Man undergoes history, but does not create it. Therefore, he is not free in time. On this point, Aristotle does not go beyond Plato. But his system is still less acceptable than the Platonic system, for it includes even the transcendent free act. In fact, since eternity is in time, and the eternal concept is related to eternity in time, all possibility of going outside of time is excluded. One is outside of time only by being in time. A temporal existence that one could choose outside of time would be conceptually unknowable, because it would not be eternal in time, whereas the concept can be related only to an eternity in time. In short, to the extent that man changes, he does not know, and not knowing, he is not free by definition. And to the extent that he knows, he does not change, and hence is not free either, in the usual sense of the word. Indeed, for Aristotle, as for Plato, one can have an absolute knowledge of man only by relating man to eternity. The individual soul is too small to be known. Plato says in the Republic, to know it, one must see it enlarged, that is, one must contemplate the city, or the polis. Now, for Aristotle, Plato's eternal state is but a utopia. In actual fact, all states sooner or later change and perish. Hence, there is no absolute political knowledge relating to one of the possible forms of the state. But happily, there is a closed cycle in the transformation of states, which is eternally repeated. Therefore, this cycle can be understood conceptually, and by speaking of it, one can grasp the different states in man himself through concepts, to be sure. But if all this is true, history has nothing to do with what is called history today, and in this history, man is anything but free. Therefore, by replacing geometry with biology, the Aristotelian variant of the Platonic system explains man as animal, but does not explain him as historical and free individual. It does not even explain him, as Plato did, as fallen angel. Alongside the great philosophies, there have always been more or less barbaric or barbarized theories. The Platonic Aristotelian notion of the concept has also been barbarized, either by vulgar and absurd denial or by a distorted acceptance. The vulgar denial consists in saying that the concept, far from being eternal, is just as temporal as any other thing existing in time. It is our possibility, of which I shall not speak, since it does away with the very idea of a true or genuine knowledge. It is skepticism or relativism, which Plato denounced under the name of sophistic, which Kant criticized, calling it empiricism, and which Husserl quite recently denounced once more under the name of psychologism. Let us speak no further about it. That option is where he says the concept just is time, and time is just change, and therefore the very notion of knowledge is undermined if knowledge is just identical to time, which is always changing. Therefore, knowledge has no universal eternal quality to it, and therefore it's not really knowledge at all. Let us rather say a few words about the distorted acceptance, which is no less absurd, although less obviously absurd. People who hold this view continue to say that the concept is eternal, but while being eternal, it is in time, which means they say that it is related to what is in time, that is, to the temporal, not to time, but to the temporal, that is, to what is in time. And being related to the temporal, it is related to it in time, existing in time, before the temporal properly so called. It is a well-known notion of the a priori, or the innate idea that precedes experience. This a priorism, called dogmatism by Kant, is what the famous first sentence of the introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason is directed against. There is no doubt, Kant says, more or less, that experience, that is a temporal reality, always precedes in time the concept that appears in time as my knowledge. And indeed there can be no possible doubt on this subject. Vulgar a priorism begins from a supposed fact and ends in a truly untenable conception. On the gnosiological level, as well as on the anthropological level, where the notorious free will is discussed. One need only develop this a priorism somewhat in order to come either to skepticism or relativism, or to Kant, or finally to the return to Plato and Aristotle. Kant, like every philosopher worthy of the name, knows full well that the concept can neither be defined as temporal nor be related to the temporal, which, by the way, amounts to the same thing. For him, as for Plato and Aristotle, the concept is eternal. Now, being eternal and not eternity, the concept must be related to something, and related in the strict sense of the term, that is related to something other than itself. But seeing the difficulties that Plato and Aristotle encountered by relating the eternal concept to eternity, Kant had the unheard of audacity to relate it to time, and not, of course, to the temporal, that is, to what is in time. The whole Kantian conception is summed up in this celebrated sentence, quote, "Without intuition, the concept is empty. Without the concept, intuition is blind," unquote. But before speaking of this Kantian formula, I want to mention in a few words another solution to the problem, namely Spinoza's. For those of you who don't know about this particular relationship of the history of philosophy, originally Kant writes the first critique and just mentions Spinoza and says, ha, dogmatism, and how funny. Between that and the second edition of the first critique, he goes ahead and reads Spinoza, and he has a complete turnaround on his opinion of Spinoza. And he makes it then explicitly clear that he sees it as two ways for philosophy, that if you're a perfect dogmatist who is uncritical and he's going to do the outdated metaphysics, or at least what he thinks is outdated, you can only be consistent and remain a Spinoza. So Spinoza is the perfection of philosophy in that sense for Kant. In that dogmatic mode. And the only other option is, of course, Kantian critical philosophy. And then Kant has his own admittance that he doesn't have a way to tell you which is really better. That, depending on your choice of what it is that you want out of it, you're going to have to choose. You have only two choices: Spinozism, dogmatism, or Kantian critical philosophy. It's an interesting point. Continuing. As I have already said, Spinoza's system is the perfect incarnation of the absurd, and that is why when one tries to realize his thought, as we say, one experiences the same feeling of dizziness as when one is faced with a paradox of formal logic or set theory. Now, a particularly curious thing, absolute error or absurdity is and must be just as circular as the truth. Thus Spinoza's and Parmenides' absolute knowledge must be symbolized by a closed circle, without a central point, of course. That's figure 12. Indeed, Spinoza says that the concept is eternity, whereas Hegel says that it is time. They have this much in common. The concept is not a relationship, or if you like, it is in relation only to itself. Being and conceptual thought are one and the same thing, Parmenides says. Thought, or the concept, is the attribute of substance, which is not different from its attribute, Spinoza says. Therefore, in both cases, that is, in Parmenides, Spinoza, and in Hegel, there is no reflection on being. In both cases, being itself is what it reflects on itself in and through, or better yet, as concept. Absolute knowledge that reflects the totality of being, therefore, is just as closed in itself, just as circular as being itself in its totality. There is nothing outside of the knowledge as there is nothing outside of being, but there is an essential difference. Parmenides Spinoza's concept being is eternity, whereas Hegel's concept being is time. Consequently, Spinozist absolute knowledge too must be eternity. That is to say that it must exclude time. In other words, there is no need of time to realize it. The ethics must be thought, written, and read in a trice, and that is the thing's absurdity. Plotinus, however, accepts this consequence. Seems a fair enough description. Not entirely true, but fair enough. That thing of the absolute error or absurdity is and must be just as circular as the truth. That reminds me of that Gotthard Gunther, the CT mind thing we read a few weeks back.
Yeah.
This absurdity was already denounced by Plato in his Parmenides. If being is truly one, or more exactly the one, that is, if it excludes diversity, and therefore all change, that is, if it is eternity that annuls time, if, I say, being is the one, a man could not speak of it, Plato remarks. Indeed, discourse would have to be just as one as the being that it reveals, and therefore could not go beyond the single word one, and even that. For time is still the crucial question. Discourse must be intemporal. Now, if he has not the time, man cannot even pronounce a single word. If being is one, or what amounts to the same thing, if the concept is eternity, absolute knowledge reduces man to absolute silence. Footnote 11. Plato accepts this. The one is ineffable. Yeah, Plato goes so far as saying that the one is not just beyond time. The one is beyond being and non-being. It's beyond any determinable concept. I say, for man, that is, for the speaking being that lives in time and needs time in order to live and to speak, that is, in order to think by means of the concept. Now, as we have seen, the concept as such is not, or at least it does not seem to be, necessarily attached to time. The universe of concepts or of ideas can be conceived of as a universe of discourse, as an eternal discourse in which all the elements coexist. This is what Plotinus says. And as a matter of fact, there are, it seems, non-temporal relations between concepts. All Euclid's theorems, for example, exist simultaneously within the entirety of his axioms, and Plotinus insists on this fact. Hence, there would be a non-temporal discourse. Footnote 12. Just as there are non-temporal movements, as Descartes correctly remarks. Oh, that's interesting. I'll have to look into that. The idea of the Spinozas system, then, is not absurd. Quite simply, it is the idea of absolute knowledge. What is absurd is that his system is supposed to have been fabricated by a man who in actual fact needed time in order to fabricate it. Accordingly, in Plotinus, the system belongs to the eternal intelligence. Or else, again, the system can exist outside of time, but, starting from temporal existence, there is no access to the system. The Spinozas system in Hegel's logic, for which there would not and could not be a phenomenology that leads to it, or else it is Descartes' system to which one could not find access through a discourse on method. Well, I disagree with that here, that if there's something eternal, it cannot, this is somehow in contradiction to being able to access it in time. Because it's literally what he mentioned earlier. It's the distinction between the empiricist and the a priori. The a priori does not have a temporal or a spatial determination to it. It is concepts. Concepts, precisely because they are not in their character temporal. It's not part of understanding a concept that you have to pay attention to how much time it's taking for you to think about it. That's irrelevant. It doesn't matter where you think it either. a concept is a concept anywhere and everywhere. It is properly eternal, and therefore you have access to the eternal in time. At least one can say that from the Hegelian standpoint, which obviously Kojeve doesn't think, his interpretation of Hegel is not in accord with that here, but I dare to say he is just wrong on this. That, starting from a temporal existence, there is no problem accessing a system of eternity. Which I think is also clear in all these prior thinkers, like Spinoza and Plato, in which, you have access to thought, bingo, there you go. You have access to an eternal reality. And that eternal reality does not necessarily involve some other kind of analogical natural existence. For example, it doesn't require a spiritual world, although, Plato certainly has room for a spiritual world. I don't know that Spinoza does, but you do have access to an eternal domain, which is a domain of thought.
Yeah, even in Plato, it's what even allows thinking, because you require ideas to be able to think of particulars.
Yeah. So continue.
Yeah, I think the big distinction with Hegel is that the universal self-particularizes, and the particular self-sublates back into the universal. So they reciprocate. You have the eternal in time and time in the eternal.
Yeah, that would be it. For Hegel, the very passing of time is already an eternal moment.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder where Kojeve's going with this.
The gist so far is that he's trying. He's talking about Hegel, but he's already made clear that he doesn't think that what he interprets Hegel to be doing works.
Right.
So this is leading to a critique.
It seems like, a survey of various, thoughts about time and eternity and the relationship of the a priori to the a posteriori. But the way he's writing, it seems like he misunderstood Hegel.
Yeah, definitely. This does not, or at least it hasn't gotten to. It doesn't seem like it's going to get to. There was some parts which I thought were in these chapters, but I guess they're not. I suppose they must be in the actual first 3 lectures, which get more into just the meat of what people find interesting about the phenomenology generally. It's self-consciousness itself and all that jazz. So next time, once I finish this chapter, I'm gonna go back to the first ones. So continuing, the ethics is made in accordance with a method of which an account cannot be given in human language, for the ethics explains everything except the possibility for a man living in time to write it. And if the phenomenology explains why the logic appears at a certain moment of history and not at another, the ethics proves the impossibility of its own appearance at any moment of time whatsoever. In short, the ethics could have been written, if it is true, only by God himself, and let us take care to note, by a non-incarnated God. Well, indeed, that's certainly an issue with Spinozism. It cannot it takes into account that, of course, there is finitude, but it cannot explain why finitude exists at all. But that's not just a problem with Spinozism. That's literally a problem with everyone prior to Hegel, including, people like Fichte, including people like Schelling, in which they want to give this explanation, but I think they fail. At least as I understand them, they fail, because even though they're cognizant of the fact and they want to explain it, they end up, Schelling ends up, abandoning philosophy proper in the end. He goes and does this whole thing. Well, it's God's will. God has a plan. There's the Ungrund, the Urgrund, and ultimately God has to rise. God has this process in which there is that in God which is not yet God, and temporality is the process of God coming to consciousness of themselves. But God isn't waiting around to be God. God is already God, and so there's a sense in which God already is conscious of themselves, but is functioning like the Aristotelian, ultimate telos, which is drawing all of reality to itself. Likewise, you can say that. Spinoza doesn't have that kind of view, for sure. He doesn't have that kind of hermeticist flavor. Fichte, though, also seems to have something similar, in which Fichte has a whole infinite striving thing that he takes up from Kant. And so the reality is just this infinite striving of reason or God or the self to be itself completely, but there is no absolute closure. Continuing. Therefore, the difference between Spinoza and Hegel can be formulated in the following way. Hegel becomes God by thinking or writing the logic. Or if you like, it is by becoming God that he writes or thinks it. Spinoza, on the other hand, must be God from all eternity in order to be able to write or think his ethics. Now, if a being that becomes God in time can be called God, only provided that it uses this term as a metaphor, a correct metaphor, by the way, the being that has always been God is God in the proper and strict sense of the word. Therefore, to be a Spinozist is actually to replace God the Father, who has no Son, incidentally, by Spinoza, while maintaining the notion of divine transcendence in all its rigor. It is to say that Spinoza is the transcendent God who speaks, to be sure, to human beings, but who speaks to them as eternal God. And this, obviously, is the height of absurdity. To take Spinoza seriously is actually to be, or to become, mad. That's the consequence of all mysticism, ultimately, and all monism, in which, yes, the conclusion is, I have always been God. If you've ever read into Hindu gurus and even the specific philosophies like Advaita Vedanta, Buddhist Nirvana, all that jazz, that is the conclusion. Not only, I have become enlightened, but it's literally a contradiction. It's he says absurdity. I'm not sure in what specific sense he means it, but it is an absurdity in the sense that to the understanding it's a contradiction, in which somebody becomes enlightened, in Buddhism, for example, mostly, and they said I realized I was always enlightened. I just didn't realize that I was. This is particularly something that famously comes up in Zen more than other forms of Buddhism, in which the idea is to already realize, to enlighten one's enlightenment. Funnily enough, this also comes up in Taoism. Certainly comes up in Hinduism as well. So there is that contradiction in which one has this kind of moral duty to awaken, but once you awaken, you realize that technically speaking, there was no need to awaken because one already was awake. One just didn't realize it. And so the awakening isn't really an awakening in a quote-unquote real sense. It's just an apparent sense. And obviously these traditions all have a big issue with thinking, in which they see thinking as the barrier. The reason we weren't enlightened to begin was because we were thinking about it too much. It's thought that is the enemy. It's knowing conceptually that is the enemy for them. If only we didn't have this barrier of thought, we would all just be perfectly enlightened in bliss and be living in harmonious natural existence.
They identify thought with the understanding, and so they think that thought only produces divisions, but can't produce the unities.
Yeah.
I think it's why Nietzsche liked Spinoza's ontology.
I don't know much about
Eastern
that.
Ontologies.
Yeah, man, I don't know much about that. I know certainly he must have liked Spinoza's metaphysics of power. But Spinoza's metaphysics of power is not at all Nietzsche's metaphysics of power. Spinoza's power is very rational, and Spinoza's whole notion of power is not, oh, we'll just try to enforce your will to power and shape the world to what you want. There are so many necessities couched as conditions of this power to actualize itself as a power, that, you know, with Spinoza, you're forced to have to consider the entirety of society and the conditions of the world. You know, at some points, Spinoza says you might want to believe you had the power to do something, but actually you didn't. You know, if you fail to do something, you know, you say like, oh, you know, if only I had dropped my addiction, you know, like 10 years ago, you know, how much would I have done? You know, and it's like, you know, if only I had just like willed myself more to drop it. And Spinoza would say, well, you didn't have that power then. You have it now because you finally did it. But before, you didn't do it, not because, you know, it's some kind of failure of your will, as if, you know, it was some choice of yours. No, you literally did not have the power. It's not up to you whether you do or do not have the power. It's not. It's up to the reality of the conditions, you know. And if your will fails, it's because your will simply did not have that power.
Yeah, I can see how thinking runs contrary to that conception. Like, why would it exist in the first place? Why would we need to think the logos or whatever if we are already in it?
Yeah, that's ultimately an issue. And I'm not entirely sure that it is an issue that clearly he's not aware of. I think he clearly must be aware of it, and I don't buy that, you know, these people who have these interpretations like, oh, well, you know, he just kind of bites a bullet and, you know, says, now, well, you know, it might appear otherwise, but, you know, really it's this way. I've read some other interpretations which say, no, he does take it into account and he tries to explain it. But admittedly, I never finished reading the Ethics, although I do find it fascinating, and I haven't gone back and finished it, and it's definitely been more than about a decade now since I tried reading the Ethics before I read Hegel, so it's definitely been quite a while. But yeah, there likely is more to say about that than what's being said here. Continuing. Spinoza, like Hegel, identifies man, that is to say, the wise man, and God. It seems then that in both cases it could be said indifferently either that there is nothing other than God, or that there is nothing other than man. Now, in point of fact, the two assertions are not identical, and if the first is accepted by Spinoza, only the second expresses Hegel's thought, and that is what Hegel means by saying the Spinoza system is not a pantheism, but a cosmism. It is a universe, or the totality of being reduced to God alone, but to a God without world and without men. And to say this is to say that everything that is change, becoming, time, does not exist for science. For if the ethics is, in fact, concerned with these things, how or why they appear in it is not known. Okay, that clarifies some things. I know that Hegel called it a cosmism. I wasn't exactly sure why. I never bothered to look into it.
It's the unreality of finite things, because they are like only substance is real, and so they are basically. Damn it! It's actually been a little while since I went over this. I won't be able to give a good articulation of it.
No, that sounds very clear.
The point is they're completely subsumed in substance in Spinoza.
It's like Parmenides.
Like they don't have a moment of genuine independence.
Yeah. Not only that, they don't really have difference. These are just apparent things to us. They're not real. You know, Spinoza is completely against negativity. It's pure positivity. There's only positives. There are no negations in God. If it appears so, it's only because it appears so. But reason tells us there can only be positivities. But then we can't understand why there are different positivities and why that doesn't count as negativities. And of course, Spinoza can certainly not account for that. So continuing. With the use of our symbolic circles, then the difference between Hegel's and Spinoza's systems can be represented in the following manner. That would be the 2 pages back. There's the circles. Let us start with the theistic system. In its pure form, it is Plato's system, but in general, it symbolizes possibility too. See figure 13. For Aristotle, several small circles must be inscribed in the large circle to symbolize the relation of eternity and time. Figure 14. But these circles ought to have fitted together. In the end, there would again be the Platonic symbol with only one small circle. That is to say, all truly coherent theism is a monotheism. I certainly agree with that, and I think historically this is the case. I don't think there really is such a thing as polytheism ever. If you actually look into anything that's supposedly polytheist, there is a clear understanding that these gods are not at all equatable with God. For most of these, they have these primordial forces, but they recognize that these are still distinct from the one. It just happens to be that for what is normally called polytheism, God as such is an unconscious thing that is, or rather, it's just a thing that is beyond this world and beyond anything that we can understand. Therefore, it's kind of a useless God. You don't pray to it, you don't do anything with it because it doesn't care. It doesn't relate to you. So, the rest of everything else is unloaded to the gods, so-called, in which they're existent entities and, they'll care about what you do and say. Continuing. But these circles ought to have fitted together in the end. Sorry. As for Kant, the same symbol can serve, but the small circle must be drawn with a dotted line to show that Kant's theology has for him only the value of an as if. Figure 15. In short, the symbol of the theistic system is valid for every system that defines the concept as an eternal entity in relation to something other than itself, no matter whether this other thing is eternity in time or outside of time, or time itself. But let's return to Spinoza. Starting with the theistic system, Hegel does away with the small circle, reduced beforehand by his predecessors to a single point. See figure 16. Spinoza, on the other hand, does away with the large circle. See figure 17. Hence, the symbol is the same in both cases, a homogeneous closed circle. And this is important, for we see that it is sufficient to deny that the concept is a relation with something other than itself in order to set up the ideal of absolute, that is, circular knowledge. And indeed, if the concept is related to another reality, an isolated concept can be established as true by adequation to this autonomous reality. In this case, there are partial facts, or even partial truths. But if the concept is revealed of being itself, it can be established as true only through itself. The proof itself no longer differs from that which has to be proved, and this means that the truth is a system, as Hegel says. The word system is not found in Spinoza, but the thing itself is there. Setting aside Parmenides, Spinoza is the only philosopher who understood that the principle of all or nothing is valid for knowledge. Either one knows everything, or else one knows nothing. For one sees that one truly knows something only by seeing that one knows everything, and that is why the study of Spinoza is so instructive, despite the absurdity of his point of view. Spinoza sets up the ideal of total or systematic or circular knowledge. However, his system is impossible in time, and Hegel's whole effort consists in creating a Spinozist system which can be written by a man living in a historical world. And that is why, while admitting with Spinoza that the concept is not a relation, Hegel identifies it not with eternity, but with time. On this subject, see the preface to the Phenomenology, page 19. We shall see later what this means. For the moment, I want to underline once more that the symbols of both systems are identical. They differ only in their source, which is not seen in the drawing, doing away with the small or the large circle. And again, this indeed corresponds to the reality. It is understandable that a temporal knowledge would finally embrace the totality of becoming, but it is not understandable that an eternal knowledge could absorb everything that is in time, for the simple reason that it would absorb us ourselves. It would be the absolute knowledge of knowing, which would have completely absorbed self-knowing, and this obviously is absurd. I shall stop here. To know what the identification of the concept with eternity means, one must read the whole Ethics.
Rip.
Let us proceed or return to Kant. Kant agrees with Plato and Aristotle, in opposition to Parmenides, Spinoza, and Hegel, that the concept is an eternal entity in relation with something other than itself. However, he relates this eternal concept not to eternity, but to time. We can say, moreover, that Kant defines the concept as a relation precisely because he sees the impossibility of Spinozism, just as Plato had done to avoid the impossibility of Eleaticism. Perhaps he did not read Spinoza, but in the transcendental deduction of the categories and in the schematism, he says why the Spinoza's conception of knowledge is impossible. It is impossible because for us, that is, for man, without intuition, the concept is empty. The Parmenidean Spinozas and Hegelian concept, which is not in relation with a being other than itself, but which is being revealing itself to itself, this Parmenidean Spinozas concept is called the transcendental I, or the transcendental synthesis of apperception in Kant. Transcendental in Kant means that which makes experience possible. Now, experience is essentially temporal, and everything that is temporal belongs to the domain of experience. Transcendental, therefore, means that which makes the temporal as temporal possible. Kant says that the transcendental entity is before time or outside of time. Hence, the transcendental is eternal, or as Kant himself says, a priori. This is to say that it precedes the temporal taken as temporal. To say that there is episteme, absolute knowledge, truly true truth. I love when that stuff happens. Is to say that there are universally and necessarily valid concepts. That is, concepts that on the one hand are valid at every moment of time, and on the other hand exclude time from themselves. That is, can never be modified. Therefore, it is to say that there are a priori or transcendental or eternal concepts. Now, the eternal concept, like every eternal entity, is not eternal in and by itself. It is eternal by its coming from eternity, by its origin. Now, the origin of the eternal concept is the transcendental I, or the transcendental synthesis. This I, or this synthesis, therefore, is not eternal. It is eternity. Therefore, Kant's transcendental self-consciousness is Parmenides' substance conceived as a spiritual subject. That is, God. It is the real eternity, that which reveals itself to itself in and by the concept. It is the source of all being revealed by the concept and the source of all conceptual revelation of being. It is the eternal source of all temporal being. An interesting aside, Kant almost literally says that the self, which is necessarily, the capital S self, capital I, that is thought itself, and then this then leads also to the necessary consequence that God is thought itself, and that's part of what leads to the German idealist position as specifically idealist. I've only heard mention it once in a set of lectures that I listened to. It's a very interesting point. I try to find where exactly he says that. He doesn't exactly say it, but he almost says it. No, sorry. Continuing. However, Kant says, we men can say of the transcendental I that it is, and that it is one, but that is all we can say of it. In other words, Kant accepts the Platonic critique of Parmenides. If the concept is eternity, then absolute knowledge reduces to the single word. Don't know what that says in Greek, or
the one.
Okay, the word one or the one, and there is no possible discourse.
The word "n" is like
ends.
being.
Okay, like being.
Like the participle of a me, which is to be.
Yeah.
So
So that's like what
that which is and the one.
Oh, okay. I thought ens was Latin.
Yeah, the Indo-European etymology is the same everywhere, but there's a fun fact about the Latin ens. It's the original participle of the Latin word for to be, but it ended up just meaning the one who's at fault, like in the court, the one who did it, basically. So they had to replace it. They had to find a new word for the Greek n, which was ont, O-N-T.
Oh, okay. It's interesting etymology.
They had to make up a new word.
Did not know that. Thank you. Alright, so moreover, strictly speaking, one cannot even say of the transcendental I that it is and that it is one, for as we shall soon see, the categories of being and quantity cannot be applied in this case. Therefore, the most that can be said is that it is something and not nothingness, but one cannot say that it is a thing having such or such qualities. Now this being, of which one can only say that it is a being which, as Hegel will say, does not differ from nothing. Nothingness. The Parmenidean Spinozas system is therefore impossible, Kant says. The essential self-conscious unity of eternity has 12 aspects, which are the 12 famous categories concepts. These 12 aspects of eternity are obviously eternal. They precede everything that is in time. They are before time, hence they are valid at every moment of time, and since they exclude time, they cannot be modified. They are a priori. Now, Parmenides and Spinoza's error or illusion consisted in this. They believe that the eternal which comes from eternity reveals this eternity by determining it, that is, by qualifying it. For Parmenides and Spinoza, the concept categories are attributes of the one which is and can be attributed to it. Now, for Kant, none of this holds true. None of this holds true. Sorry, footnote 18. Footnote 13. For Plotinus, they cannot be attributed to the one, but they can be attributed to the one which is, which for him is the second hypostasis, intelligence, or the intelligible cosmos. All right. Now, none of this holds true because it is impossible, and at the end of section 16 of the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant explains why. A determination of eternity by the eternal concept categories would be possible only by an understanding, quote, through the self-consciousness of which, he says, quote, the whole manifold would be given at the same time, or else, unquote, or else again, by an understanding such that the objects of its representations exist through the sole fact of the existence of these representations themselves. In other words, by a divine or archetypal understanding, otherwise known by the famous term intellectual intuition, which is a fascinating concept in my opinion. It's probably one of the most interesting things that comes out of the ancient idealism. And with Descartes, we get at least access to one instance of this divine archetypal power of thought. Self-consciousness is literally that kind of entity. Self-consciousness only exists insofar as you enact the activity of becoming conscious of yourself in thinking. So only by the fact of thinking is self-consciousness existent. The moment that you do not reflect upon yourself, you're no longer self-conscious. So it's an entity that only exists by its own, here in the words of self-representation. So the thought constitutes its existence. Thought itself also is entirely of this nature, at least as logic. It is a self-constituting being, one would say, which exists only by the fact that, it thinks itself. So, the thought constitutes the fact, the existence.
Yeah, it's the thinking of thinking in Anaxagoras.
And I certainly think this is an interesting distinction which carries consequences in Hegelianism. Continuing. For in point of fact, the being which by thinking of itself thinks of everything that can be thought, and which creates the objects thought by the sole act of thinking of them, is God. Hence Spinoza was right to give the name God to Parmenides. How would you say that?
Wait. I lost. Oh, well, it's the same thing. It's the same thing.
Enzens?
The one that is, I guess.
Okay, the one that is. Which coincides with the concept that reveals it. But he was wrong to forget that God alone can apply this concept to himself. For us who are not God, to apply our concept to God is to relate the concept to something other than this concept itself. Now, the concept which is a relation in the proper sense of the word, that is a relation to something else, is at most eternal, but not eternity. This is to say, either the very basis of Spinozism is false, the concept is not eternity, or else, if the concept is eternity, only God can be a Spinozist. To assert that one is not God and to write the ethics is not to know what one is doing. It is to do something of which one cannot give an account, to do something absurd. But in principle, according to Kant, God could write the ethics. The whole question then is to know whether a man, Spinoza, can be God. Now, for Kant, this is impossible, because man can draw nothing from the content of his self-consciousness. Taken in itself, the human eye is a point without content, an empty receptacle, and the manifold content must be given to it. It must come from elsewhere. Or what amounts to the same thing, it is not sufficient for man to think in order that there might be true knowledge. In addition, the object of which man thinks must exist, and exist independently of his act of thinking of it. Or else, again, as Kant says, human consciousness necessarily has two constituent elements, the Begriff or concept, and the Anschauung or intuition, the latter presenting a manifold content given to man and not produced by him, or from him, or in him. The concept possessed by a being that is not God is therefore a relation. In other words, it can be eternal, but it is not eternity, and that is why Spinozism is absurd. It is absurd because Spinoza is not God. But there is still the conception of Plato and Aristotle, which admits that the human concept is a relation, but a relation related to eternity and not to time. That is to say, eternity, or God, implies the manifold in its own unity, and it itself creates the manifold which it reveals by the concept. Therefore, being the eternal development of eternity in itself, this manifold itself is eternity. It is the manifold universe of ideas, concepts, which has nothing to do with the world of space-time, but it is eternity itself that develops itself in this universe. Our merely eternal concept does not produce it. Hence, this universe is given to us, and our concept is related to it. In other words, our absolute knowledge is not the knowledge which God has of himself. It is a knowledge which we have of God, of a God essentially different from us, of a transcendent God. It is a theological knowledge in the strict sense of the term, a knowledge which is the relation of the eternal concept to eternity and not to time. Now, according to Kant, this too is impossible, for the simple reason that the relation of the eternal to eternity must itself be eternal or non-temporal, whereas our knowledge is not only in time, but even more important, it itself is temporal. We need time in order to think. In principle, Kant says, there could be a non-spatial temporal intuition, Anschauung. In principle, the concept categories can be applied to any given manifold whatsoever. Therefore, a non-divine being could, in principle, develop an absolute knowledge revealing the non-spatial temporal universe of the Platonic ideas, but the non-divine being called man cannot do so. Spinozism is possible only for God. Platonism is possible only for a non-divine intelligence other than human intelligence, an angelic intelligence, for example. For once more, and this is an irreducible and inexplicable fact according to Kant, see reference the end of section 21, for us human beings, the given manifold is always a manifold given in spatial temporal form. We can think only provided that a manifold is given to us, but this manifold must exist in its whole and in each of its elements. Therefore, Parmenides' one and unique being must be differentiated into a manifold being. But for us, the identical can be diverse only provided that it is space or is in space. As a matter of fact, two identical geometrical points can be different only by their positions in space, and space is nothing other than the infinite whole of points which are rigorously identical with respect to their intrinsic character, which, by the way, is the absence of all character, and are nonetheless different from one another. But in order that there be knowledge, the diverse must be identified. Every act of knowing is a synthesis, Kant says, which introduces unity into the given manifold. Now for us, diverse can be identical only in time or as time. Now there was a footnote, where was it? Footnote 14. Oh, it's right there. Footnote 14. As a matter of fact, to identify the point A with the point B is to cause the point to pass from A to B. Generally speaking, to identify two different things is to say that they are one and the same thing which has changed, and time is but the infinite whole of all identifications of the diverse, that is, of all changes whatsoever. Continuing. Therefore, for us, knowledge, that is, the identification of the diverse, can be accomplished only in time, because the very identification of the diverse is time. It was always known that the human concept appears at some moment of time, and it was known that man needs time in order to think, but Kant was the first to see that this is not accidental, but essential to man. Hence, the world in which man thinks is necessarily a temporal world. And if actual human thought is related to what is in time, the Kantian analysis shows that time is what makes the actual exercise of thought possible. In other words, we can use our eternal concepts only provided that we relate them to time as such, that is, provided that we schematize them, as Kant says. Therefore, the transcendental I, which is simply self-consciousness, is Spinoza's God, and we can say nothing about it. The transcendental I, source of the categories concepts which are related to a non-spatial temporal manifold, that is, to an eternal manifold, is the I as it was conceived by Platonic, Aristotelian, or pre-Kantian philosophy in general. Now, this I is not human, for it is supposed to be able to think outside of time. Therefore, only the transcendental I, which is the origin of schematized categories, that is, of concepts related to time, is the human transcendental I, which makes actual human thoughts possible. After the sentence says, for it is supposed to be able to think outside of time, footnote 15, it is not sufficient to geometrize physics, as Plato and Descartes do. It would still be necessary to geometrize the thought of the philosopher who performs this geometrization, that is, to exclude time from his thought itself. Now, this is impossible. The ideal of the universal tensor in modern relativist physics is the ideal of a non-temporal knowledge. The whole content would be given simultaneously in this formula, but even if this tensor is possible, it is only an algorithm and not a discourse. All discursive thought is necessarily developed in time, because even the attributing of the predicate to the subject is a temporal act. Okay. Continuing, human thought is accomplished in time. It is a temporal phenomenon. As such, it is purely empirical. It is a doxa. But in order that the eternal concept be applied to the temporal, it is first necessary to schematize the concept, that is, to apply it to time as such. This application is accomplished before time or outside of time. It is a priori, that is, unmodifiable and always valid. Therefore, absolute knowledge is the entirety of the relations between the eternal concept and time. It is the entirety of the synthesis of the grounds, as that is. Synthesischen Grundsatz. It is Kant's ontology. Let us now see the result of this Kantian conception for the world and for man. In the natural world, time is represented by motion. The temporalized concept, therefore, is related to real motion, and what makes the temporalized concept possible, that is, the schematism of the relation to time and anterior to time, corresponds to what makes real motion really possible, that is, force. Therefore, to say that the eternal concept is in relation with time is to set forth, among other things, a dynamic conception of matter and the world, that is, a physics of forces. Hence, Kantian philosophy will necessarily encounter Newtonian physics. And inversely, if the world actually is as Newton's physics describes it, Kant's philosophy must be accepted as a given truth. Okay. But even leaving aside the fact that the Newtonian world is just as uninhabitable for man as Plato's geometrical world, we can indicate an insufficiency in the Kantian Newtonian conception of the purely natural world. The impossibility relating the concept to eternity ultimately means the impossibility of having an absolute geometrical understanding of the world. In other words, the notion of the cosmos, that is, the eternal or static structure of the natural universe, is denied, and consequently the existence of eternal structures in the world is not explained. In particular, the biological species cannot be explained as it is by Aristotle. Generally speaking, purely spatial structure is not explained. The motion of the planets, for example, is explained by force, but the structure of the solar system is not explained. And here the impossibility of explaining is absolute. The fact that in the real world laws apply to stable entities is for Kant a transcendental chance. One can say that's the way it is, and that is all one can say about it. To be sure, Kant develops a theory of the living being in the third critique, but this theory is valid only in the mode of as if, since the third critique has no equivalent in the system. Footnote 16. This is so precisely because knowledge, properly so called, starts with the relation between the concept and time, and not between the concept and eternity. Continuing. And what is valid for the animal in particular is also valid for the animal in general, that is, for the cosmos. Here, too, the cosmology, in other respects like that of Leibniz, has only a regulative value, and the same holds for God. God being eternity, there is no possible knowledge relating to God. In the end, if Kantian knowledge is closed, that is, total and definitive or absolute, we again find the theistic or Platonic schema of two circles. But since the concept is not related to eternity, the small circle remains forever purely hypothetical. However, when it is done away with, what is obtained is not the single closed circle of Hegel, but the open circle without fixed limits of skepticism. Indeed, since the eternal concept is related to time, no absolute equation is possible. At best, it is the infinite eternal of time which can completely fill up the framework of the eternal concept's categories. Thought that is in time, therefore, never attains this end, and that is why Kant says that absolute knowledge is an infinite task. Let us now see what the Kantian conception means on the anthropological level. The concept is eternal, but it is related to time. If the concept is eternal, it is because there is something in man that places him outside of time. It is freedom, that is, the transcendental I taken as practical reason or pure will. If this is relation of concept to time, there is also application of pure will to the temporal reality. But to the extent that there is a priori concept, which means here act of freedom, the relation of time is accomplished before time. The act of freedom, while being related to time, is therefore outside of time. It is the renowned choice of the unintelligible character. This choice is not temporal, but it determines man's whole temporal existence, in which therefore there is no freedom. Thus we again meet Plato's myth. However, in Plato the concept is related to eternity, while in Kant it is related to time, and this difference finds expression here in the fact that the transcendental choice is effected not as in Plato with a view to what man is or has been outside of time, but with a view to what he is or will be in time. In Plato it has to do with an affirmation, in Kant with a negation. There it has to do with becoming in time what one is eternally. Here, with not being eternally what one has become in time. there acceptance of eternal nature, here negation of temporal nature. Or to restate it, there freedom of the angel who clings to or separates himself from God, here freedom of fallen man who repudiates his sin in a single extratemporal act. Therefore, there is in the description of the natural world, Therefore, here, as in the description of the natural world, there is a progress, but in both cases, there is an irreducible insufficiency. Man as historical being remains inexplicable. Neither the world of concrete things in which he lives, nor the history that he creates by temporal free acts is understood. In the end, we end with the following result. Possibility 1 is excluded because it cannot be realized by man. Possibility 4 is likewise excluded because it does away with the very idea of a truth in the proper sense of the term. Possibility 2 gives partial explanations, but in none of its three variants does it manage to give an account of history. That is, a man taken as free creator in time. In any case, even if one can barely manage to speak of an infinite historical evolution in the Kantian or criticist variant, it is impossible to attain an absolute knowledge relating to history, and hence to historical man. In consequence, if philosophy is to attain an absolute knowledge relating to man, as we currently conceive of him, it must accept possibility 3. And this is what Hegel did in saying that the concept is time. Our concern is to see what that means. Alright, we've been going for a while, so we will leave that there. Kind of disappointed in this lecture. It's not interesting in the way that I hoped it would be. It's mostly just recapping stuff that I already know all too well about too many things. This is like Hegel 101 as far as like I'm concerned. It's like the kind of topics that I began with when I got into Hegel like about 8 years ago or so. So I'm already very, very well acquainted with these kinds of arguments. And I mean, he's making good arguments here, but it's nothing new for me. I guess I was wrong that there were certain things I was looking forward to which haven't shown up, and I suppose that then they're not in this chapter like I thought they were. So I think there's one more section, one more lecture, and we'll be done with that. Anyways, for those of you listening, I hope you found that useful. See you next time.